your own, totally feel free to do that. But we're going to start today with Thomas Hardy on page 9. I'm a big Hardy fan. I mentioned that before. I wrote a book about Hardy. I find Hardy theologically fascinating. One of the chapters in my book is actually about Hardy and God. And he is such a complicated figure in terms of thinking about different approaches to theology that I included 3 poems here that do all different things. So people often will ask me, how does Thomas Hardy feel about religion, or sort of where does he stand religiously? It's impossible to answer that question because he tried out so many different kinds of religious philosophies, which is one of the reasons I love to read him. It wasn't like someone like Tennyson, who, even when he felt conflicted, was sort of expressing a consistent philosophy through his lifetime. Hardy tried out every sort of thing, and so you can't really read a poem and say, this is how Hardy feels. Hardy also loved to take on voices, so sometimes he was pretending to be someone else, or imagining himself as someone else. He was a novelist, so that's something novelists do, right? And so his poetry, we can't take, I think, as a reflection of his philosophies, but they can introduce to us some different ways of thinking of or conceiving of God, all of which are, I think, useful just for our own thinking in various ways. So that's why I've included 3 poems from one poet, because he's such a complicated figure. And then I think we'll end today with a Jewish poem, Jacqueline Osherow's At the Wailing Wall. She's a contemporary poet who also writes a lot about Jewish faith and Jewish practice in her poetry. So that's sort of the trajectory for today, and we'll see what we come up with. So the 3 Hardy poems, I tried to put them in an order that made sense, are the Oxen, Hap, and the Convergence of the Twain, which is one of his best known poems. So we'll start with the Oxen and see if we can figure out what he's saying here about his relationship, about the speaker's relationship with faith. Not that it's necessarily Hardy.
Did he dabble outside the Anglican theology, which I'm sure he was raised with?
It's a great question.
Or did he interpret it within that framework?
It was usually within that framework. He really thought about God is connected, I think, to the church in a fairly traditional, high church Protestant sort of way. But his concern was a broader concern. It wasn't about specific doctrinal sort of impositions, but about how God functions in the world in what feels to me like a relatively non-denominational way. You have to see what you think about that. He wasn't a particular churchgoer or anything, but he was thinking about God's place in the world all the time.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you.
Sure. Okay, so the Oxen. Christmas Eve and 12 of the clock. Now they are all on their knees, an elder said, as we sat in a flock by the embers in hearthside ease. We pictured the meek, mild creatures where they dwelt in their strawy pen, nor did it occur to one of us there to doubt they were kneeling then. So fair a fancy few would weave in these years, yet I feel, if someone said on Christmas Eve, "Come, see the oxen kneel in the lonely barton by yonder coombe, our childhood used to know," I should go with him in the gloom, hoping it might be so. So we have to know a little bit about the story that he's playing with here in order to understand what's going on in this poem. But you can tell already, that it's a narrative poem because he's telling a story, and it's a remembered story. So he's talking about himself as a child and saying this thing that happened. So we have to understand just a little bit of the sort of the Christian story here. On Christmas Eve at midnight, they were told by the elder, right? Some group of children, maybe their parents were in church, it was like a Sunday school program sort of thing, but they were told that at the moment of Jesus' birth, all of the animals knelt down, okay? So that's, it's pretty conventional sort of story that's told, that the animals themselves were kneeling. And this sort of like natural recognition that Jesus was being born. That, to me, is not the interesting part of this. The interesting part is what happens at the end. But he's picturing this as a child and saying all of the children there in the second stanza, we pictured the meek, mild creatures where they dwelt in their strawy pen. And we know, of course, that Jesus was born in a manger, so there's this connection to the animals. Nor did it occur to one of us there to doubt they were kneeling then. So it's not just that they didn't doubt, it didn't even occur to them to doubt, right? And that speaks, I think, to something about the purity of children's faith, right? The elder stands in front of them and says, this is the thing that happened, and the kids go, yes, that happened. Okay, it didn't even occur to us to doubt. There's a break in time between the second and the third stanzas here, right? The poem stops that recollection that we see in the first two stanzas and jumps to a present tense, thinking back. So fair a fancy few would weave in those years. So now let's think about what that means. We get a little lost in the meaning because of the alliteration, right? But what's so fair a fancy?
It's a story, a fair story.
A fair story, beautiful story, right? That's
fancy.
But fanciful, right? There's like a sort of like moment of imagination. Few would weave in these years, right? So you have to pause between so fair a fancy, few would weave, but it all flows into each other because of the sound. So few of us today would make up a story like this, right? In these years, yet. Okay, and Hardy loves a good yet. He does this all the time. Yet I feel if someone said on Christmas Eve, come, see the oxen kneel in the lonely barton by yonder coombe, our childhood used to know, I should go with him in the gloom, hoping it might be so. So here he's saying, I'm past that kind of childhood naivete and innocence where I'm just going to believe what someone tells me. You know, no one today, myself included, would make up a fanciful story like this. But if someone came to me and said, guess what, it's Christmas Eve, the oxen are all kneeling down, I'm going to go because I hope, right? There's that little bit of, I still want that. So now my question for you guys is, what's the that he's hoping to hold on to? The hoping it might be so.
That truth would come back from that time, that it really is so, even though he knows that it's not so in that moment. He would like it to be the truth,
right. So
be real.
So he's hoping for a couple things. One is that this thing about the cattle kneeling is real, right? He wants that. And what's the other thing that's sort of behind that wish?
That the story is true.
Well, that's the same thing, right? That it's actually happening.
Regain his childhood.
Absolutely. Yeah, he wants that easy belief again, that ability to think back to that moment and say, yes, I wouldn't have even had a doubt. Right? So it's asking in a way for both of those things and recognizing at the same time what about adulthood?
Well, but you know it's not, and it's too bad, and you've left that behind.
That's exactly right.
You would like to go back.
Right.
You would like it to be so.
Absolutely. So one of the things I love about this poem is it's a little sing-songy, it feels a little childish, it's got a little rhyme, it's a story, it's very sweet, and it's got a really complex kind of kick of emotions at the end. There are a lot of different things being expressed in a poem that on its surface feels quite simple and straightforward, but the mix of emotions is complex and I think also very relatable, right? That sense of, I remember when, and this I think maybe reminds us a little bit of the Tennyson poem we were talking about last time, right? He remembers when he had an easier belief. Now something bad has happened to him and it's hard for him to believe again. In this Hardy poem, we don't have a sense that something in particular bad has happened to shake his belief. It's just maturity has happened to him, right? Experiencing the world has happened to him. Maybe something bad, but it's not a particular event. It's just more like I've grown up and now I know that doubt is a thing that occurs. And I wish in a way that this were true and that I could still believe that it was true. And I have a little bit of regret that I can't, but maybe also a little appreciation that I'm grown up now and I wouldn't weave this kind of fanciful story anymore. So all of those things mixed together here. And for me, I can't speak for you all, but I know that set of emotions, like that mixed set of emotions of the kind of moment when you grow up and you say, how'd they all fit on the ark? Or something like that, right? That at one point just felt like something that your rabbi told you, you accept, you say, that's a great story, or here's what I can learn from this, or whatever. And I don't know if I should say this on camera, but I have a 12-year-old son, and he's sort of going through this moment right now of saying, but how do we know that it's true? And how did Yaakov wrestle in a dream? Like all of these kinds of questions. And I think that like that 12-year-old age, like if this was a 9-year-old maybe, right? And there's that moment of being a 12-year-old where you start to go, wait a minute. And you still wish for that simplicity and that belief. And you want to not doubt, you want that thing to be true. And you also recognize that it's sort of a natural part of being an adult or being a bigger person, that you can, that you can't completely hold on to it in the same way that you once did. He's capturing all of that here. So thoughts on that? You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'm just saying, we all lie to kids. I mean, it's a
Oh,
natural
that's
thing.
farther than I was willing to go.
We
We all
all
lie to kids.
exaggerate, we give them fairy tales and we claim they're true. And,
Right.
so this is the problem.
Do you think that's what the elder's doing here, though?
What?
Do you think that's what the elder's doing here?
Yeah, I think so. Because maybe he has some
Interesting.
kids and he's wondering, you know.
Right, that's interesting. So I'd like to believe that it's a nicer sort of motivation than that, which is that the elder actually believes the thing he's saying, right? That this is a theological belief. It's not a fairy tale for him, right? In the same way that I wouldn't want to say, you know, I told my kids the story of Noah because I lied to them. Like, right? That's a pretty complicated theological statement to say when we tell our kids stories from Torah, we're lying to them. This is not Torah, obviously, but it's a religious
But
belief.
all the kids get told about Santa Claus, and
Right.
so and they all get disillusioned about it. So
That's
he's
true.
come back to you.
That one falls into a slightly different category religiously, though, because there the parents do know that they're saying something that's not true. This one, I'm not so sure. I think that this is actually a belief within the faith that's hard to buy on a level, but also held as true, not like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or something like that, right? So it's interesting that you're just reading it as we lie to children, because the Hardy speaker here is reading it that way, like, this can't really be true. And also, maybe it's true, right? And I think we feel that way about certain kinds of stories where we haven't seen this thing with our own eyes, but we still want to believe that it's true. We don't think it's a lie. Right? That's why I think the Noah's Ark example maybe is closer to this one than the Santa example, because this is something that they would actually believe.
If you're teaching children religion from the start,
Yes.
you have to, I mean, that's the way it always has been. You start with the story, whether or not you believe it,
Right.
you start from one point. So we
Right.
don't know that the elders, but it's their
Right.
responsibility
Right.
to present this.
Oh, so then you're reading it the same way he is. That it's like,
Quite.
maybe
I
you
mean,
don't really believe it, but you're presenting
in
it.
a more serious sense.
Yeah.
And it's not telling them a story. I mean,
Right.
the elder was raised on it too,
Yeah.
and it is part of their
Right.
faith.
Right,
you know,
exactly.
so-
Right. And that's the conflict that's presented in the poem. Yeah, good.
First, what is a Barton in the younger pool?
Oh, okay. So Hardy often invokes very old-fashioned language. She was raised in the country, so these are like country terms. And the Barton is like the field. And the coombe is it's like a farm structure. I don't know if it's exactly a barn, but something like that.
And the other question I have is part of the belief that it happened when Jesus was born.
And then
And
continues. Sorry.
it
yeah.
happens every year.
And every year at midnight, exactly. So the thing about that
So
that's
that's
different from just a Bible story, it's
verifiable.
verifiable. Exactly. Right, it is verifiable. Yes, that's the idea that happens again. So maybe it's something that the elders tried to check out and doesn't actually believe. Hard to know.
So my question is it in the scriptures about this flock, or is it more?
No, it's more like Midrash.
Right, because what it reminded me of is like there's the story like that on Shavuos the sky opens.
Yeah.
So to me that's like the perfect parallel.
Right,
You know,
nice, that's
like,
right.
You know,
And if you try to verify and don't see it, maybe you just missed it.
right.
It doesn't mean that it didn't
cloudy
happen.
or-
Exactly,
you know what I'm
right.
saying? So
right.
that
That's
is
good.
the parallel I saw.
That's a great one. That's a very good example, actually, right? Because it's not
Less
just a
serious
historical
than Noah's
thing.
Ark or-
It's something that's right, and it's not scriptural in the
Exactly.
same way. But there's still
That's
a
what I mean.
sense of like
Of
you
belief.
want to believe it, and it may be true, and it's a
Exactly.
little hard to find out if it's
Exactly.
true. Yeah,
Or Eliyahu Hanavi comes and drinks.
that's a
from
great
the,
one.
Right.
That's a great one.
Seder
Yeah.
cup,
Right.
and you check it out, like, oh, this is
Right.
good.
Right. So that's also a place where maybe we lie to kids a little bit, right?
Uh-huh.
If someone pours some of that out and then
Right.
says, "Oh, he came," or "It looks like less," and stuff, and they don't really mean that in a serious way, but adults also are singing Eliyahu Hanavi and opening the door and like believing that on some level. So those are both great analogies for this. And he wants to believe, and he struggles with belief. Right? Yeah. Go
But
ahead.
I think the word gloom here is also very indicative.
Yeah.
I think he feels like the world is a gloomier place when you don't have
that's
belief.
right.
The
Absolutely.
world is very boring and dark, and it's bright and light when you feel holiness, or you feel this special
Excellent.
connection. And
Right.
I think that, in a less literal way,
Right.
is what he's looking like. Even if he doesn't see the oxen kneel, he wants to dispel some of
The gloom, excellent, beautiful. That's right. And the gloom is posited like right afterwards with hope. right? Hoping it might be so. There's still definitely a doubt and a skepticism there, but there's a wish for something. Right, okay, that's a great place to start with Hardy, and now we're going to see something completely different in the next one, okay? Hap is one of his earliest poems. He didn't publish it until later, but he wrote it early. So again, if you're looking through his work as a kind of historical trajectory to say, oh, I can trace some movement theologically, you can't. It's all over the place. So let's look at Hap. This one's a little bit more complicated in the language because it's not a narrative poem in the same way. Do you need another copy? I have extras. You're good? Okay. Hap. If but some vengeful god would call to me from up the sky and laugh, thou suffering thing, know that thy sorrow is my ecstasy, that thy love's loss is my hate's profiting. Then would I bear it, clench myself, and die, steeled by the sense of ire unmerited, half eased in that a powerfuler than I had willed and meted me the tears I shed. But not so. How arrives it joy lies slain, and why unblooms the best hope ever sown? Crass casualty obstructs the sun and rain, and dicing time for gladness casts a moan. These purblind doomsters had as readily strown blisses about my pilgrimage as pain. We're gonna have to pull that one apart a little bit because the language is hard, but we'll talk through it, and then we'll be able to talk about the issue that's raised. It starts with if, which is a good setup for the poem because he wants to say this first clause, the subordinate clause, right, the if, and then lead to something else, which is the then in the next part, okay? So, if what? Just what's the if? What's the subordinate clause? What's he wishing for here?
If my suffering were on purpose, intentional,
Perfect.
and ordained from on high, then
Exactly.
I know it was an on high.
Exactly, that's exactly right. So, if God called down to me, and he's not quite ready to go like God, capital G. We're just going with some God. So that's another statement in itself. But if God would say, I have chosen you to suffer, right? Your misery is dictated by me, chosen by me. You know, your sorrow is my ecstasy. Your love's loss is my hate's profiting. Okay? Now that doesn't seem like much to wish for right there. That's a pretty awful wish. But actually what this speaker is saying is, then, right, and this is our next 4 lines, I would bear it, clench myself, and die, steeled, made stronger by the sense of ire unmerited. I didn't do anything wrong. God chose me for suffering for some reason that's beyond my comprehension, but at least it was a choice, right? God singled me out. I would know that there's a power on high that's for whatever reason chosen me to suffer. And I would deal with that, right? I would prop myself up and I would say, okay, this is how the world works. This is what I've got. Half eased. So not entirely comforted by this, but half comforted that a powerfuler than I, and here we do get the capital, right? He loves to play around with words for God that are not God. So this one that's powerfuler, had willed and meted me the tears I shed, right? Willed, right? Done it purposefully, and meted, given them out to me, right? So that's what we've got as the setup for this poem. And I'll just point out here that this is a sonnet, and, sorry, it's an almost sonnet. No, it is a sonnet, sorry. And he splits the first 2, right? So if we think about this the way we were talking about it before, the Italian and the English, it feels like it's pretty clear that it's 8 lines and then 6 lines, right? Because we have but not so, which is the volta, the turn in the sonnet. But he still splits up the first half, the first 8, rather than making them a single unit, to point out the if and the then. Okay? So it ends up feeling like it's in 3 pieces. But the if and then fit together. If this happened, if God called out to me, I hate you for no reason that I can articulate in particular, and I want to cause you pain, then I would just move on, deal with that, and say, okay, you're more powerful than I am, that's the way it is. The rest of this poem, I mean, that's painful enough as a setup for a poem, right? The rest of this poem is so painful, because look at the next thing he says, but not so. Okay? That scenario I just described, that's not the way it is. Here's the way it is. But he does it with a question. How arrives it joy lies slain? And why unblooms the best hope ever sown? Which is basically a very poetic way of saying, why am I so miserable? Why is everything that I wish for destroyed? And here's the answer after the dash. Crass casualty obstructs the sun and rain, and dicing time for gladness casts a moan. These purblind doomsters had as readily strown blisses about my pilgrimage as pain. Do you understand what's going on there?
Just
It
random.
was random chance. Yep, could have been anything. Just random chance. Crass casualty, which also gets capitals, okay, obstructs the sun and rain. Just, and it's like just randomness, right? Casualty, not in the way we would use it, like there were casualties in the accident, but just something that just happened, right? And dicing time, not God, but time capitalized, right? Which gives us that kind of medieval sense of time as a sort of fate, right? Like the Wheel of Fortune, right? Just a thing that happens. For gladness casts a moan, right? We'll take that happiness and just override it with moaning. These purblind doomsters, what are the purblind doomsters? Casualty and time, exactly, chance, right? And doomsters gets a capital D also. They could have as easily strewn blisses about my pilgrimage as pain. They could have as easily made me happy as they could have made me pain. So it's not God choosing me for suffering, it's randomness, and I could have just as easily been happy. None of this was dictated for any meaningful reason. Wow, like that's an approach to God, right? So what do you think here? It's very different from what we saw in the last one, hoping it might be so. This is so confident, but not so. Here's actually how it is. There's nothing, no order, no rhyme or reason, just total randomness. This is as dark as we're gonna get, just to let you know. Yeah.
Quick question, dicing time.
Yes.
For gladness casts a moan.
It's a hard line.
Time is tossing the dice. When you cast the dice, what came up
Right.
was a moan instead of gladness.
That's exactly right. That's exactly
You're
right.
playing a game.
Right. But there's another possibility also of dicing in the sense of time cutting up things into little, yeah.
But then
So
cast doesn't quite work out.
cast doesn't work as well that way, yeah. But I think he's using dicing to mean both of those, right? That dicing, that time is like sort of like connected to the word meet, right? To meet out, right? So the time is sort of chopping things up, but then the cast Simone brings us to that other possibility for dicing time as like playing a game with my life, basically.
Because this reminds me actually of Return of the Native when they're when they're casting for something very important.
right.
They're casting their dice out there.
Excellent, yeah. Has anyone else read Return of the Native? Classic Thomas Hardy novel. Eustacia Vai? No, okay.
Big revenge.
Yeah.
Thomas Lee.
What?
Thomas Lee.
Yeah.
Who I'm named after.
Oh, wow.
But anyway,
You're named after someone in a Thomas Hardy novel?
Yes.
That's fantastic. Okay. Absolutely. And it's a hard line, but you do take away from it that sense of the randomness, right? That there was no purpose. And that leads us then into it could have as easily been bliss as pain. There's something a little bit Eov in here to me, right? Eov, like the book of Job, right? There's like a little bit of that sense of, but even when you look at Job, it's very purposeful. God is very much a presence there. So we don't understand why those things happen, but it's like a sense of there's suffering, there's so much suffering, it can't be understood. But then he ends up saying it's not what the book of Job says, which is God making a choice, but or God allowing someone to make a choice, right? But actually no God at all. And then go back to the title, just hap. Hap.
Like happenstance.
Like happenstance, exactly. Right, not like happiness, but like random occurrence.
So
Yeah.
it's basically an irreligious poem.
This one is, yeah, it does feel that way, absolutely. And so I'm presenting that one because it shows us the same author speaking so differently in one than the next, right? He doesn't have a series of poems that say there is no God, there is no God. It's one poem, right? And all of these different poems that try out these different kinds of approaches to God and wonder why. A lot of people think Hardy must have had such a horrible life to write a poem like this, but he actually didn't have a horrible life. He had a perfectly nice life. I mean, in the way that life is complicated, right? He lost his first wife. He remarried. I mean, but this sounds like there was some serious misery, right? And I don't think that that's him. I think that that's him trying out different voices and experimenting with different kinds of ways to think. And it may be that he really felt this in a moment, but a moment later he wrote something else that felt differently. So it's sort of interesting to see that. But yes, I would say, I mean, gosh, is it an irreligious poem? That's such a hard question for me, because I think religiosity is really complicated, and it's definitely a poem that says that God is not present, but the fact that it's still wrestling with that idea of God makes me think that on some level it's a religious poem. Does that make sense? It's sort of a complicated definition of religion. But I feel like an irreligious poem would be one that doesn't even broach the question, right? One that feels this angry about the question feels like on some level a religious poem to me. I know that I'm a little odd in that reading, but irreligious to me is like, I'm not even concerned about this question. This is so angry and so sad, and also I think in a way is so hoping it might be so, back to the previous poem, and in this one just saying it's not, but I wish it were, right? Even a vengeful God would be better than this. That feels like a kind of religious sentiment to me. It's someone who's struggling with belief for sure, but wants it on some level. Just has reached a point right now of saying, I don't have it, but I wish I did, I think, right? That goes back to the if-then.
Well,
Yeah.
also, it's interesting to me that he personifies the randomness.
Yes,
He
that's
didn't have
right.
to do that.
Right.
I mean, he's got these guys, you know, you almost picture them, hey, you know, what are we gonna, oh, too bad for Artie, what are we gonna, like, you know, there's still something going on.
Right, that's right.
And that's interesting to me, that he just didn't say there's no rhyme or reason to it at all.
That's right.
He's actually personified this
Excellent.
lack of rhyme or reason in these characters.
Excellent point. That's great. And I think that does actually suggest there's something. Maybe it's
Yeah.
not the God that he would want to see, but something's still controlling.
Exactly.
And it's something personified, not just the world keeps turning. Although if you know his novels at all, you see that there is that sense like the world keeps turning and things are always tilted towards the negative, right? Things are always moving that bad direction. I think if you read Tess of the D'Urbervilles in particular, you see that. It's just like, man, you can see the bad stuff coming for her a mile away. And you kind of like, at every point where there's an opportunity for it to be course corrected, you say, come on, like, I feel very like manipulated by that novel, right? So you're just like pulled towards it. You want to see something good happen, but the way that Hardy's world tends to work in the novels, not in Far From the Madding Crowd, but in most of the other ones, it's just tilted towards the negative. And I think that's what you see here too. But the wish, I think, even in a poem as negative as this, the wish is so strong for belief, or for God, or for a controlling hand, even if it's a vengeful one. It's an interesting thing to wish for, right? A vengeful God. But at least it's a God. Oof. Tough stuff. Yeah, did you want to say something?
Well, just, I guess, two little points.
Sure.
The first is that when reading this poem, I'm not messing with the question. It's not. It's kind of like, yes, Eov comes into it, but Eov is able to present his case, and in a sense, Hardy's presenting his case here.
Yeah.
But there is an answering God in Eov. This poem, when I read it, I think, you know, is this really? I mean, to me, it raises the question of whether the powerful or the nigh is actually preferable to crass casualty.
So this speaker says yes. Whether we would think so, experiencing whatever pain he's experiencing, who knows, right? People would have different reactions to that. But he says that it would be preferable. Because he would be able to say, all right, at least it's God wanting this for me. He could be Eov. He's wishing for Eov, right? Because God says, look, you just can't understand me, right? You weren't there. You can't see the big picture like I can. And that's meant on some level to be a satisfying answer. It's a frustrating answer, but it's meant to be a satisfying answer. So he's saying, I'm worse off than Eov because at least he gets a powerfuler. I just get random chance.
Well, he also gets an answer.
True.
It's
True.
maybe not a completely satisfying.
It's maybe not a satisfying answer, but it's an
he
answer.
gets,
That's right.
He gets an answer.
Right.
The answer is not completely
It's true.
It's that you don't understand.
That's right.
You see things.
He's complaining about indifference.
That's exactly
Any action
right. That's
would
right.
be fine, but
That's right.
indifference is just too terrible to.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Most of us don't usually think, though, of Eov as our ideal. If only I had that, right? But he's actually pointing out that that's better than this.
And
Yeah.
the other thing
Jeff.
I would point out is just, or maybe this goes back more to the novels, but also in the poems, that the important thing, yes, on one hand, Hardy writes about, he's writing about these kind of universal, chants or malevolent God and tests. I think he gets when she ends up with, kind of caught by at Stonehenge.
Right. The final scene there is at Stonehenge.
There's
Yeah.
some kind of there is some kind of
More power. Yeah.
Some kind of consciousness.
Yeah.
Some kind of,
Yes.
But he's almost always also about the possibility of human integrity and recognizing, and this operates here too, and recognizing that this is what our condition is.
Right.
And that's
right.
an important part of the poem. It's
That's
not
right.
just about what's out there; it's also what's in here.
Interesting. Yeah, about what he's wishing for
Medicine, I think,
himself.
to some extent.
Absolutely, yeah. There is a real self-reflection here, but ultimately the anger feels externally directed, right? To not having that kind of powerfuler. But certainly he's trying to reckon with himself too, and his own sense of belief. So yeah, great points. Did you have a comment, Elsa?
I think that in that last stanza, he's talking about how the randomness could have done good things for him as well as bad. And
That's
he
right.
kind of doesn't like that. I think he would prefer the angry God who's talking
Ooh,
to him
interesting.
to just randomly spin
Happy.
the dice and you get happiness, or
Right.
because you don't really deserve it then either. It's just meted out to you.
That's a great question. So if we actually see here 3 options instead of the 2 that I started with. I was saying the options were you're going to be miserable no matter what. Your 2 options are miserable because of God or miserable because of chance. He would choose miserable because of God. But you're saying, actually, there's a 3rd option, which is not miserable at all. Pleased, right? Happy. Which I guess brings up a 4th option too. We can make it into a quadrant, right? Pleased because God has chosen you for pleasure, right? Which seems not to be on his horizon at all as even an option, but it's implied. Miserable because of God, miserable because of chance, or pleased because of chance, that he might choose miserable because of God above pleased because of chance. That's really cool. I like that. Do you guys see that as a possibility? Yeah. And it's an interesting choice, too. It shows a sort of strength of character to wish for that.
For that connection.
Yeah, exactly. But pleased seems like almost too much to ask, right? It doesn't even seem like it's a real consideration here that happy could be part of it. Okay. Given that now, that sort of complicated theology of Hap, the one that's I'm wishing, but nope, I've decided this isn't how it is, but not so. So now let's look at the next one. Okay. The next one is the last of the Hardys that we're going to read, and he gives us a little bit of a clue when he subtitles it Lines on the Loss of the Titanic, so you know what your reference is here. And there's this cute little thing he does where each of the stanzas is supposed to look a little bit like a boat. Do you see that? Just no, the big part and then the little 2 on top. It's It's, yeah.
Sitting on the water.
Yeah, exactly, sitting on the water, that sort of outline. So this is in response to the Titanic. It was published in the same year after the Titanic sunk in April. So we're going to read through this one and see how differently he approaches the idea of God here. In a solitude of the sea, deep from human vanity and the pride of life that planned her, stilly couches she. Steel chambers, late the pyres of her salamandrine fires, cold currents thrid, and turn to rhythmic tidal lyres. Over the mirrors meant to glass the opulent, the sea worm crawls, grotesque, slimed, dumb, indifferent. Jewels and joy designed to ravish the sensuous mind lie lightless, all their sparkles bleared and black and blind. Dim moon-eyed fishes near gaze at the gilded gear and query, what does this vaingloriousness down here? Well, while was fashioning this creature of cleaving wing, the imminent will that stirs and urges everything prepared a sinister mate for her, so gaily great, a shape of ice for the time far and dissociate. And as the smart ship grew in stature, grace, and hue, in shadowy silent distance grew the iceberg too. Alien they seemed to be. No mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history, or sign that they were bent by paths coincident on being anon, twin halves of one august event, till the spinner of the years said, now, and each one hears, and consummation comes, and jars 2 hemispheres. I love this poem. So amazing. Okay, very different view of the world, but let's make sure we got the sort of surface level of it first. Yeah.
This is different from the one before.
Very.
In the one before, he claims that it's circumstance and time and thing, and here something is planned
Very much
to
so.
do
Yeah.
damage.
That's right, exactly. This is almost what he was wishing for in Hap, right? Some vengeful god who planned it all out. It's here. Vengeful might be actually a little strong for this one, but planning anyway, right? There's a bigger picture here that humans couldn't know, and that's quite different in its religious philosophy than Hap. Let's just make sure we've got it though. So he starts with, in solitude of the sea, deep from human vanity and the pride of life that planned her, stilly couches she. So where are we starting? What's the image?
Oh, it's underwater.
Underwater already, right?
The
So we're
underwater
like,
wreck,
right, we're looking at the wreck, okay? Deep from human vanity. Why does he bring up human vanity right at the beginning? Because of what you know about the Titanic.
Because that's what it is.
Exactly, right. That idea of the Titanic as so opulent and
Yes.
so lavish, and in the way that it was even talked about at the time, like in the early 19 teens, as Tower of Babel, right? Everyone who was saying the unsinkable ship or whatever.
The
then-
fastest Atlantic crossing.
Right. Then even at the time, people were saying, "Oh, you're, risking yourself. Exactly. You're bringing some bad luck on yourself, or you're trying to be too godlike." So he's sort of playing with that idea already. That deep from human vanity and pride of life actually is a New Testament allusion. It's in the Book of John. So it works well in this context, pride of life, but it also has this sort of larger biblical context for him. Stilly couches she. Who's she? The ship. Okay, just making sure. Ships.
Why stilly? What's stilly compared to still? What's the difference?
Oh, well, it's for the rhythm, but also grammatically, right? It's just the adjective. The adverb form because it's describing couches. Yeah. He loved old-fashioned language too, so he played around a lot. We saw that in the Barton in Yonder Coombe. He really thought that older, more antiquated words captured something that modernism didn't. And so it's interesting. There was kind of a debate between him because he's writing at the same time as the famous modernists like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, and he was purposely not using that kind of James Joycean sort of language. He was like, I'm an old-fashioned guy, and they mocked him for it. So there was a little bit of a tension at the time between he was seen very much as a Victorian poet. Now, I think actually that's a mistake. I think people confuse the fact that he had standard forms and that he used this old-fashioned language to say that he wasn't modern. I think that's actually a mistake, but that's a big debate in literary circles. Should he be posited against people like Pound and Eliot? If you know those poets, you know that they do much more experimental things, and he's much more traditionalist on the surface. But I actually think you don't have to scratch the surface very far to find that he's asking very modern questions. Anyway, unlike the Victorians. And then we have a series of stanzas, 4 really, that have those first 2 lines about what the ship was, and the third longer line of what it is now. And it's a great little back and forth parallel that he creates. Steel chambers late the pyres of her salamandrine fire. So we had you could picture what it was in its heyday, and now, instead of the fire, cold currents of water, thrid, right, move through it, and turn to rhythmic tidal lyres. Right, so we have the tide, the rhythm of the tide beating on it instead of the glorious fire that it once was. Similar thing in the third stanza. Over the mirrors meant to glass the opulent. To glass is to reflect, right? The term for mirror. And now what? The sea worm crawls, grotesque, slimed, dumb, indifferent. It's very visceral, the way that he describes it. Yeah.
Can you go a little more to the salamandrine fires? That's kind of a strange image.
It is. Why do you think he uses that term? What?
I've always assumed that it refers to the ship actually on fire. Salamanders, were seen as being able to survive fire.
Right.
and the ship itself.
And the ship
in a
caught
way,
fire.
Has, but I mean, maybe it could be referred to like this kind of bright life on board.
I think that's more what it is, especially when you look at the pattern that he creates in those 4 stanzas together, that the salamandrine fires are, and when he says steel chambers, that suggests it's contained, the fire, right? So that's like,
Well,
it's
we
like
saw the
actual
ship, it
ovens
says
and,
still still like the structure is still there underwater.
so you see the chambers as the ship as a whole, like the chambers people lived
I
in.
think of still a funeral.
Right, that's right.
No, I think.
Yeah, I read it a different way, but I see why you could see it that way.
Talking about the engines, the
That's what I
coal
thought too,
fires
yeah.
that were burning, moving the
Right,
ship.
right.
And now it's just the tar. It
That's
doesn't
how
go-
I read it also. I read it that way, and I'm reading it that way because of the pattern that's created in the next stanzas of like, this is what it was, the glory that it was, and now the sort of the cold, empty, whatever that it is now, as opposed to picturing the ship burning as it's going down, especially because the setup of the poem is, here's where it is now. This is the first stanza, right? We're under the ocean. And then each of the next is, here's what it was, here's what it is. Here's what it was, here's what it is. And then he talks about the progression that got us to this point. Pyres, you're right though. I mean, it's got obviously a death image. So maybe it's hinting at that. But I haven't read it that way. And I haven't seen others read it that way either, although I'll look and see if there are other scholars who see it the way you do. As that's about burning. I've read it as being about the engines or the fire where it was meant to be on the ship, not fire once it was out of control on the ship.
To me, it reminds me of some of those like Dutch still life paintings with very opulent fruits and all this kind of stuff, and then it'll have like a skull or some sort of reminder of
That's
death
great,
that like
yeah.
you could try. It's
Yeah.
all vanity to try
Right,
to.
awesome. Yeah, that's a great comparison. So we've got the engines now cold, the mirrors now crawling with worms, the jewels, right, designed to ravish the sensuous mind, all bleared and black and blind, which is fabulous alliteration too. Sounds almost like Hopkins when he does bleared and black and blind. And then in the 5th stanza we have something different, which is this sort of almost funny image of the fishes kind of like, what's going on here, right? Gaze at the gilded gear and query, right, and are asking, what does this vaingloriousness down here? Which also is kind of insulting to humans, right, that even the fishes look at it and go, vaingloriousness. And then we have that ellipse, and the 6th stanza starts a new tone, and he's great at that too. It feels very like that well with the colon is a lot like, but not so. And you notice in all 3 of the poems we read that there's a sort of pause, and now we're starting a new thought, right? And he does that here again. Even though each of the stanzas is numbered, and they all feel like they're similar, there's a real break here when we get well. And here's the explanation. Well, while was fashioning this creature of cleaving wing, the imminent will that stirs and urges everything prepared a sinister mate for her. So I just read that less poetically, more like it's a sentence, so you can get the meaning of the line. Who was fashioning this creature of cleaving wing? I like while was fashioning. It's kind of missing the subject there, right?
People were building.
Maybe. There's another suggestion though. This imminent will, yeah, the imminent will. So it suggests that sure, people were building the ship, but he's actually taking the people out of it a little bit and saying, this was God doing this.
This is destiny.
Yeah, this is destiny, absolutely. Of course, imminent will isn't quite God either. We've got it capitalized, and it feels sort of godlike, but in the way that he likes to capitalize things and say they're kind of godlike but aren't quite, is imminent will like the purblind doomsters from Hap, or is imminent will something more like the vengeful God from Hap?
Both.
It could be both, right?
Yeah.
Imminent will is one of the terms he goes to a lot. He uses it several times. And remember, it's imminent the way we don't use it as often, with an A, not with an I. It doesn't mean like immediate, it means everywhere. That's imminent, okay? Not like this is about to happen, like imminently. Okay, so
The spelling is different.
the spelling's different. That's why I said it's with an A, not an I.
Right.
Yeah, but some people mistake it and think imminent, but it's not. It means the will that is everywhere. So it feels a little bit like it's God creating the ship at the same time. This imminent will that stirs and urges everything. Just think about that in comparison to what we were saying about Hap. the imminent will that stirs and urges everything, that's saying the exact opposite of what we just read in that previous poem, right? God controls, there's some power that controls everything. And even when humans think they're building the ship, you know, this is a bigger plan. Yeah.
We're not talking about the ship here. We're talking about a shape of ice.
Oh, it's both. While was fashioning this creature of cleaving wing, that's the ship.
But while it was fashioning, you said that's an interesting way of putting it. What was fashioning is completely passive.
Right.
While it was being created, while the creation process was going on
Right.
by people, this creature of cleaving wing.
Right. That's the ship. That's the ship.
Human will, and that I believe is completely. It's you starting a new clause. I don't think it's.
Interesting. So I'm reading the first one, if we just go
Well,
grammar
so
for a
is
second.
An action of the imminent will.
That the first clause, while was fashioning this creature of cleaving wing, as a modifier, right? And then this, the imminent will, is the object of the modifier.
Oh, I wasn't. I thought that started the description of the person making the iceberg.
Yeah, it does
God
both.
making
It's
the
both. Yeah,
iceberg.
yeah.
And the first two was the ship.
So it's not, I don't think it's totally clear, but I think the while was fashioning doesn't say while you were fashioning or while we were fashioning or while humans fashioned, purposely to suggest that the imminent will may have been doing both. The imminent will can be read backward onto the first clause and forward onto the next. Otherwise, why bother with that weird phrasing of while was fashioning?
Because it's the irony of it.
That
Like
people
here,
were fashioning?
People are making the most, like, vainglorious thing in
Yeah.
the world, thinking they're
Right.
so smart and know-it-all. And
Then why
make
not
the
put
best
people
of it.
there? Why not say something about the people there? Why have it so empty if not clear who's making it?
Oh, see, to me, it just seems obvious.
Right. I don't think there's a clear answer to this. It just feels to me that that weird phrasing is done to suggest that God, the imminent will, I'm putting God in there because that's how I'm reading it, but maybe we just want to say imminent will, I don't know. That the weird phrasing suggests that the imminent will is doing both, especially when it's the imminent will that stirs and urges everything, which includes the creation of the ship. I mean, everything has to include the creation of the ship, right? Are the people's actions outside of everything? But I don't know. I mean, the grammar there is complicated because it's not a fully grammatical sentence. It leaves out that subject so that you have to put it in there. Is it just people, or is it the imminent will forward and backward? Yeah.
In comparing these two poems,
Yes.
this one isn't finished. Hardy seems very confused.
I don't think he's
In
confused.
one, he seems to say that it's circumstance and
For
time
sure. Yeah, absolutely.
that
Yeah.
creates things that happen.
Right.
And here he believes there's some kind of an imminent will.
Yeah, for sure. But I don't think that means he's confused. I just think that means that he's using poetry to try out a bunch of different things. None of these might be him or his deep belief, right? It's one of the things about poetry, right? We like to believe that poetry is confessional. It's always like the deepest expression of someone's heart. But why can't it just be art? Like, let's try out a bunch of stuff and see what works for the art. I don't know. If you read two novels by the same novelist, and one has one sort of idea and another has another idea, would you say the novelist is confused? I feel like most of us accept it from novels in a way we don't from poems, because we anticipate that poetry should be more confessional. I sort of resist that idea a little bit, because I don't see any reason that, like a novelist, a poet couldn't just create a character here who doesn't believe in God and create another character who does. I mean, it depends how you think about the poet being the speaker of the poem, but you notice that I'm careful to say the speaker, not Thomas Hardy, because these feel to me like different speakers.
One thing that I think is interesting comparing this one to the Hat poem is the Hat poem is chance or whatever is outside where people live. You know, chance is something that happens to you. They
Right,
like
that's
roll
right.
the dice and then
Yeah.
you're assigned to
Right.
like get on the Titanic or not, or have a good life or not. And
Right.
here, it seems like chance, it could still be chance, but the imminent will is something that works within and connected
nice.
to, you know, like the iceberg doesn't have a mind of its own.
Right.
It's connected to the imminent will. The people who built the Titanic, they don't have total free will. The imminent will is kind of like guiding them. And
Yeah,
whatever.
nice.
And so that whatever happens is now connected to
Right.
people, whereas before it was separate. And I think that
Good.
separation was
Good point.
something that was bothering me.
Yeah, oh, interesting, that's very interesting, that's good, yeah.
You know, I understand what you're saying, but I think this is a very dark poem, and I think actually vanity goes against the will of God, in a sense.
Okay, yeah.
And humans and their vanity, I think, will be frowned upon and dealt with, in a sense. I mean, and this was a very vain effort here.
Right.
So I think that people, you know, they did put this fabulous ship together.
Yeah.
They may have overstepped a boundary, and
That's a very common reading of the Titanic. I don't know if it's exactly what this poem says,
that was some, yeah.
but maybe. I mean, let's get through to the end too in our like sort of second read and see if that's sort of supported by the poem.
I think it's very ambiguous purposely. I mean, the imminent will could be the Lord upstairs, or it could be just random thing from the other part.
I don't know if it
Crash
could.
casualty.
The word will doesn't suggest casualty though, right? The word will suggests
No, it's-
purposefulness.
No, but imminent will is like casualty. It's not God. It's not. There's no the Lord above or something like that.
Right, well it's not that exactly, but I think
But-
will is,
Yeah, but
will has to mean something
but the
purposeful,
same
right?
way
Like when we
the
say
other
free
form,
will.
random event could
Yeah.
be causing it. Imminent will could easily be substitute crash casualty.
I don't see it easily substituted just because those words mean different things, right? The will that is everywhere is a will. Like when we say free will, it doesn't mean random
But
chance.
Randomness is a will too.
I don't know that he sees it that way.
I mean, just things happen.
And that's a will? A will is a direction, a choice.
You're giving a life to randomness.
But would you call the life of randomness a will? Randomness is the opposite of will.
When it happens to you, it's a will.
I don't know. I don't know if I buy that argument just because of the words, but you know, interesting suggestion. Yeah.
So I just want to get back to pride of life for a
Yeah,
minute in the
uh-huh.
first stanza.
Yeah.
So I took that as like the prideful people.
That's right.
But is that what it refers to? You said it had a New Testament.
Yeah, and so
dimension.
it's a reference from the book of John, and it does have the sense of like being
But
too
it's
big
to
for
the
yourself.
people, not
Yeah,
God.
people. That's right, people.
Right,
Yes.
so then again, it sort of says
Right,
that
oh.
planter, it's going back to the idea that the people planned the Titanic, in my
Yes,
mind.
right.
As opposed
Right.
to saying, you know, which
Right.
gives the idea that the imminent
Right.
will is referring to the, in my mind,
Right.
to the iceberg.
So part of the question also is how much are the people controlled by God? Right? How much is it that the people are making independent choices, and how much is it that God saw that these two things should be brought together and somehow instructed the people to do this thing, right? And I don't think that's totally clear. But let's look at the next stanza. We've got also the shape of ice, sorry, for the time, far and dissociate, right? So for the moment, the shape of ice and the creature of cleaving wing have nothing to do with each other. They're completely disassociated, but they're sinister mates for one another. The language here is just fantastic, right? And then we have something that feels very parallel in the 8th stanza. And as the smart ship grew in stature, grace, and hue, in shadowy, silent distance grew the iceberg too. Now that takes the imminent will out of it a little bit, right? They're just both growing independently. So if we think, as from the previous stanza, that the imminent will is growing the iceberg, the way that it's presented here suggests the imminent will is also growing the ship, right? Just side by side, they're growing. And they're mates for each other, but we don't know it yet, which is exactly what he says in the next stanza. Alien they seemed to be. Seemed to whom?
The people.
It's got to be the people, right? Because the imminent will knows that they're mates for one another. But to the people, they seemed alien. And in case you don't pick that up, he clarifies it in the next line. No mortal eye could see, right? So that means something could see, but no mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history. People weren't clear enough. People had no way of anticipating what was going to happen. But there's an immortal eye that could see what was coming. At least it's implied, right?
Reminds me of the story of Babel.
Oh yeah. Well, but like that's how everybody read the Titanic. story, but he takes the people out of it a little bit. That's why I think it's a little different from the Tower of Babel, right? Because everyone read it that way, as like just human vanity and God's going to tear you down if you try to overstep your bounds. But he's saying God planned it like this from the beginning. That's an unusual way of looking at it. Okay, so there was no one could see the intimate welding of their later history or sign that they were bent by paths coincident on being anon, which means soon, twin halves of one august event. So it's one event, and the twin halves are the ship and the iceberg, which again, I think is an unusual way of looking at that historical moment. How do we usually look at it? Well, the ship crashed into an iceberg, right? Because we're looking at it from that human side. The ship is the thing that's moving. The ship is the thing that's, got some agency or whatever. And he's saying, no, they're equal halves, right? And they're twin halves of one event. And then we've got another word for God. Think about if you see this one as the same as crass casualty. The spinner of the years. That feels a little bit like dicing time, right? But the spinner of the years said, now. Like, that feels very like a power to me, right? It's not just dicing time, sort of playing a game. It's super conscious.
Like dicing time.
Do you think it is, though?
Using dicing time and crass casualty.
But then he says,
Both-
now.
both possible interpretations.
It's
of
possible.
these words.
Well, in any
That's the
case
thing, it
here,
could be both. I mean,
right, but it feels a little more consciously chosen, right? Because the spinner of the years said, now. That's really planned. That's not random. It says now, and each one hears. So now we got even more personification. The iceberg and the ship, meant for each other from the very beginning.
And now puts us in the present tense.
Yes, and consummation comes. Oh, amazing. Now, to think about them as married in this way, consummation, is such an unusual kind of image. To think they were, they're beshert, right? These two things were meant for each other, and now consummation comes and jars two hemispheres, right? I just wanted you to see this extremely, what I see is, you're reading it as a similar view to Hap. I see it as an extremely different view from Hap. Just a very different way of thinking about how the world works. And a poet here who's saying, let's think about all the ways the world might work. I'm going to lay out, he wrote 1,000 poems. I only gave you 3, right? Out of those 1,000, 750 deal with God in some way, right? Or in what's that structure of how the world works? And just to be asking that question all the time and coming up with so many different answers. Sometimes in the poems, God appears and speaks to people directly. Sometimes in the poems, God is gone completely. There is no God, right? Sometimes it says, the world is totally random, but if you just look at the glow at the edges, you can believe that there's something there. He has so many different offerings for thinking about this. And so it's not about one person being confused, I don't think, or at least that's not my suggestion. You can take whatever you want from it, but my suggestion is it's one person saying, let's think about all the possible ways this could be working and try out each different one and sort of see what sticks. I don't think he ever came to a real settled version of that, but the idea that he was struggling with it all the time, I find really beautiful. To always be thinking about all these different ways and saying in different moments, different of these ways seem to be true. And that feels like a very religious outlook to me, even though each of them feels what you might say like sacrilegious in its own kind of way.
You were using the word struggling, though.
I think so. Oh, but I don't, yeah, but not because he's confused, because it's like a lack of knowledge and then a willingness to say, where can that take me? What are all the different possibilities? But I think each of the poems shows its own kind of struggle. This one feels extremely confident. I would say Hap also feels very confident, just confident in a way that's sad. This one is confident in a way that's kind of like, yep, that's how it happened.
I like the consummation comes, which says intimacy,
Yeah.
but it's jarring.
Right.
It just takes you aback.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Because we're running out of time, let's try to do one more poem today. We may not have too much time to talk about this, but we can at least read it. It's also narrative, it's also a sonnet, and I think it's pretty straightforward, but I think we should get at least one Jewish voice in here since we spent so much time on Hardy today. So this is Jacqueline Osherow's At the Wailing Wall. I don't want to say anything about it yet. I'll just read it to you and then you can tell me what you think.
Page 12.
Oh, sorry, page 12. Do you have it? Okay. At the Wailing Wall. I figure I have to come here with my kids, though I'm always ill at ease in holy places. The wars, for one thing. And it's the substancelessness that sets me going. The holy words. Though I do write a note, my girls sound future. There's an evil eye out there, you never know. And then pick up a broken-backed Siddur, the first of many motions to go through. Let's get them over with. I hate this women's section almost as much as that one, full of men wrapped in taluses, eyes closed, showing off. But here I am, reciting the Amidah anyway. Surprising things can happen when you start to pray. We'll see if any angels call my bluff. She's pretty clever. So,
Tremendous movement.
what?
A tremendous movement.
Tremendous movement, absolutely. The last line is a nice little kick. But again, as we've been seeing in so many of the poems that I've been sharing with you, a tension, right? An internal conflict, a struggle that the people are facing. So this starts off, this poem reminds me a lot of Church Going, the Philip Larkin that we were reading last time. The sort of, here's a holy place, I get that it's holy, I'm a little bit resentful about it, I'm going to pretend that I don't really care that much, but well, you got to do it. Okay, fine, there's an evil eye, so I might as well put a note in the wall. Like, there's all of that sort of feigned casualness around it, but continuing to go through with it. And the way that Larkin ends with, a serious place for serious people, right? Where she sort of goes that way too. Well, now I'm here. I hate it. I might as well say Shemona Esrei now that I'm doing right? And then we'll see if any angels call my bluff. What's that last line suggesting? A couple different things. What's the bluff? What's the call my bluff?
That she believes.
Right. So
That she believes.
that she's a believer, right? So she's saying, well, maybe no one will be able to tell because I'm davening and I look like everybody else.
Yeah.
But internally, I don't feel what I think everybody else is feeling. Although, who knows, right? So maybe that's the angels are going to call the bluff. But then, what does it mean when you say, "We'll see if any angels call my bluff"? And the bluff is that you don't believe.
Yeah. I think the bluff is her doubt. We all have doubts.
Right.
And the bluff is doubt. She's saying it anyway, but
Right.
because the doubt is really just a bluff. The reality is she really
Interesting. And what's the suggestion that she really believes?
Or that it might be real. I mean, it might really be there. It might be so.
Sure. And
She
I think-
says surprising things could happen when you start to pray.
Right.
So she almost seems to believe maybe
Right.
something will happen.
right, good. And also, I think if you aren't really a believer, you probably aren't going to invoke angels, right? Why would it be the angels calling her bluff if really she doesn't believe? It leaves open that possibility, at least, right? Do you see that?
It's interesting.
Yeah, so you have to go through this one slowly and sort of pull apart because each line has a slightly different emotion. When it starts with, I figure I have to come here with my kids, it feels so much like that Larkin poem, right? I pull off my cycle clips, I don't even know what I'm doing here, yet I keep stopping here, and then she sort of moves in that direction too, right? The holy words, though I do write a note, my girls sound future, that sort of you never know, right? There's such an interesting sort of conflict in here. And I love this because she's picturing all these people and judging them, right? Judging them all. Those men showing off. I hate this women's section, right? All of that. And I think that it suggests, because we don't know exactly who this person is, right? That any person there might be going through that same set of emotions and maybe judging her. Right, because she is going through the motions just like anyone is there. So there's something very humanizing about, that sense of everyone around me is doing the right thing and their belief aligns with their action, except me. But you know that the person next to her might feel that exact same thing and be looking at her and saying, oh, her belief aligns with her action, but not me. And that can spread all the way through. So that judgment of others, I think, sort of bears back on her. You see her maybe suggesting to us, the readers, that everybody is feeling a similar kind of conflict in that space. Yeah, any other thoughts on this one before we wrap up? Yeah.
It sounds like she grew up within this tradition because she knows all of the different things
Sure.
that you have to do.
Right.
And so maybe she didn't choose this belief of her own
Yeah.
free will. She just kind of grew up with it,
Right.
is going through the motions, and she's questioning it. That's
Yeah. But how much is she questioning?
Right, not all the way.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Right, and that's what's sort of interesting
Right.
about it too. But I just always think, so who's not this person? Right? Yeah.
I think that last line shows a lot of sarcasm.
Okay.
That
So you don't think she's saying
feels
that
the
before?
whole thing is, she might know all the rituals and
Yeah.
everything, but she doesn't really hold them.
Maybe, except for the surprising things can happen when you start to pray, right? She's open to a possibility of something beyond just nothing. And why do it if you really don't buy it?
Well, because her children, she feels she wants to, she's with her kids, she wants to.
I think there's more than
It's
that.
her, it's her.
But here I am reciting the Amidah anyway. I mean, to say I figure I have to come here with my kids isn't the same thing as saying I figure I have to daven here with my kids. I figure I have to say the Shemona Esrei because my kids are watching me. You know, it's, you can visit a place and not start davening there. Right?
She's giving it a chance.
She's giving it a chance, exactly. I agree, yeah.
Definitely giving it a
But
chance.
that she begins to pray and then catches herself praying. And
Interesting.
she says,
Right, it almost sounds like that, but here I am reciting the Amidah anyway. Like, how did that happen? Right. Yeah, good.
taken aback at herself.
Yeah. I wish I had some easy answers for you all, but there aren't. And I think that's what's the best thing about all of these poems is that you can leave here with lots more to think about and read it again and get something a little different and read it again and find something different still and read it again in a year and it'll feel different again. And that's kind of what I love about these, all of the complexity here. For our last week, next week, we've got 2 sonnets by Mark Jarman. I mentioned those to you before. They're based on the John Donne Holy Sonnets, and they're called Unholy Sonnets. So we'll look at those. And then a poem that's one of my favorite poems called I Saw You Walking. That's a contemporary. And I'm going to bring in one more by Yoshua November, who's a contemporary like Haredi poet, actually, who's got a brand new book out. And I didn't include the poem in the packet because his new book actually literally just came out, so I'm gonna have to bring in a copy of that for you next time. So we'll do those 4 for next time. What?
Can you put it on the internet?
I'll have Josh do it.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll Josh do that one. I just
It's
the
also
book
good reading.
literally it wasn't in my hands until this week, so so we'll do those for next time. And thank you all for all your comments today, your thoughts, and I think it's good to disagree about these things because it gives us that much more to think about. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you.